Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to see your name in the credits and gain access to a plethora of other perks, bonuses, and extras, please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you.
If you meet someone in the street who you yesterday saw executed, you can say either that an extraordinary miracle has occurred or that you are under a very grave misapprehension.
You see, Christopher is talking about you as an individual seeing someone alive who you know to be dead.
His stuff on God, in retrospect, seems like weak sauce.
Not a very honest tactic coming from someone who's claiming to debunk Christopher Hitchens.
And the best that Christopher Hitchens can offer is some stupid line from David Hume. Weak sauce.
Give me a break.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that.
Evolution is a religion.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of When Theists Fail. Up for today is Daily Wire darling Michael Knowles, a theist who claims that he has debunked Christopher Hitchens.
You know, I was an atheist for 10 years. His stuff on God, in retrospect, seems like weak sauce.
Now, I'm not saying it's impossible to debunk Christopher Hitchens. I certainly don't agree with everything that the man said. But wait and see how Mr. Knowles goes about this alleged debunking. All I'll say is that it leaves a hell of a lot to be desired. But as per usual, you can be the judge. Let's dive right in and find out if indeed Mr. Knowles can debunk Hitchens.
Take it away.
If you meet someone in the street who you yesterday saw executed, you can say either that an extraordinary miracle has occurred or that you are under a very grave misapprehension. And David Hume's logic on this, I think, is quite irrefutable. He says, what is more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you've made a mistake? Especially if you didn't see it yourself and you're hearing it from someone who says that they did. After all, Lazarus was raised, never said a word about it. The daughter of Jairus was raised, didn't say a thing about what she'd been through. And the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived.
Oh, I love that Hitchens line. It's just so good. It seems like resurrection was something of a banality of the time. Ah, classic Hitchens. I absolutely love it. It's so good.
I'll give you all the miracles and you'll still be left exactly where you are now, holding an empty sack.
Christopher Hitchens is saying, well, what's more likely? That you, the individual, were deceived, or that the laws of nature were suspended? But when we're talking about the resurrection, we're not talking about you individually being deceived. We're talking about 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection being deceived.
Let's dive right into Mr. Knowles' first response here. So Michael begins by reframing the discussion, and that's just a polite way of me saying that he's dodging Christopher's point. Quoting Hume, Christopher argues that upon witnessing an alleged miracle, misapprehension is a likelier explanation than a literal suspension of the natural order.
What is more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you've made a mistake?
For example, if I witness Jesus walking on water, it's more likely that things aren't as they seem. Perhaps I'm viewing the event from far enough away that I fail to realize that the water is frozen. Perhaps it's an extremely shallow body of water, approximately 1 inch in height, so it only appears as though Jesus is walking on it. Perhaps there are rocks beneath the surface of the water that Jesus is using to lily pad across it. Perhaps none of these explanations are relevant, and I, the witness of the event, am merely hallucinating because I have temporal lobe epilepsy, or I've consumed a hallucinogenic compound, etc. These explanations, and others like them, are more likely, argued Hume, because they don't require the invocation of a hitherto unobserved supernatural element. Naturalistic explanations, such as hallucination and misapprehension, have a higher explanatory probability because such explanations have a body of evidence to support them. Temporal lobe epilepsy is an extant condition which we can diagnose, study, and treat. Hallucination as a consequence of fear, drugs, or something else is a well-established phenomenon, and so forth. Please notice the stark contrast between these naturalistic explanations on one hand and magic man can break the laws of physics on the other. As a matter of probability, and to Hume's point, it's absurd to suggest that a supernatural suspension of buoyancy limitations has occurred. It's much more likely that our understanding of buoyancy is very much intact, and that your experience of having witnessed a man walking on water is a misapprehension of some sort. But rather than deal with any of this, Michael asserts that such reasoning hardly applies, given the fact that 500 people witnessed a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. Simultaneously, I might add.
But when we're talking about the resurrection, we're not talking about you individually being deceived. We're talking about 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection being deceived.
Jesus appeared to those 500 people as a group. Suddenly, Michael argues, misapprehension becomes an unlikely candidate explanation, lest one assert that 500 people coincidentally hallucinated or misapprehended in the same way and at the same time. Did all 500 people have temporal lobe epilepsy? Were all 500 people tripping on shrooms at the same time? Clearly, misapprehension and hallucination become less compelling explanations given the number of alleged witnesses in this case. But before I address the claim about the 500 in detail, am I to assume then that Michael is conceding Christopher's and by extension Hume's point? Michael says, yeah, but we're not talking about individuals here. We're talking about 500 witnesses.
But when we're talking about the resurrection, we're not talking about you individually being deceived. We're talking about 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection being deceived.
As far as I can tell, this counts as a tacit concession on Michael's part. In other words, any miracle claim which involves individuals as opposed to collectives can be safely dismissed a la Hume's point. But I digress. I think Michael is dodging here. Rather than deal with the Humean probability argument as it pertains to individuals, Michael immediately reframes the discussion by moving away from cases pertaining to individuals, choosing instead to focus on cases which involve a collective. In this case, 500. If you don't believe me when I claim that Michael is reframing the discussion, just listen once again to the Hitchens clip that Michael is reacting to.
If you meet someone in the street who you yesterday saw executed, you can say either that an extraordinary miracle has occurred or that you are under a very grave misapprehension.
You see, Christopher is talking about you as an individual seeing someone alive who you know to be dead. In such a case, I think it's abundantly clear that Hume's point applies. It's much more likely that you're engaged in a grief hallucination, itself a very common phenomenon. Or perhaps you've simply seen someone who bears a remarkable resemblance to the deceased, etc. The point is, Christopher is spot on here, but Michael completely fails to address it. Instead, and as I've already pointed out, he immediately shifts the discussion away from individual cases, the ones Christopher was addressing, choosing instead to focus on collective cases. Not a very honest tactic coming from someone who's claiming to debunk Christopher Hitchens. But alas, let's follow Michael where he wants to go. Dishonest though his reframing is, let's pursue it and see if Michael's case improves. He alleges that we have 500 eyewitnesses who saw the risen Jesus.
We're talking about 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection.
Quite the claim, eh? So presumably, Michael has a body of evidence to support this claim. Letters, eyewitness statements, quotes, etc. But no, in typical Christian fashion, Michael just wrote a check his ass can't cash. Where then did he get this? It turns out that he's quoting the Bible, which, for the sake of being thorough, I will as well. Quote, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." And shockingly enough, that's it. That's Michael's evidence that Jesus appeared to 500 people at the same time. Ask yourself, does this count as eyewitness testimony? Does it even count as evidence? Let's take those in order. 1. Does the claim that Jesus appeared to 500 people count as eyewitness testimony? Of course not! Are you kidding me? Eyewitness testimony, by definition, requires the testimony of the eyewitness. For example, if there's a bank robbery, there's a difference between the following options. A. Interviewing 3 individual eyewitnesses and writing their accounts on paper for posterity. And B. Simply asserting that there's 3 eyewitnesses. Which of these options counts as eyewitness testimony? A. Where we have 3 individualized written accounts from 3 different perspectives, or B, where we assert that there's 3 eyewitnesses while providing nothing beyond this initial assertion. Clearly, B fails to satisfy the definition of eyewitness testimony. For all it is, in truth, is an assertion about the number of eyewitnesses, and assertions about eyewitnesses clearly don't count as eyewitness testimony. Back to the Bible then. When it says, after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, is this more like A, where we have individualized written accounts, or is it more like B, an assertion about eyewitnesses? Needless to say, it's the latter. So in reality, Michael doesn't have eyewitness testimony that's 500 people strong. All he has is an assertion that Jesus appeared to the 500. And that simply isn't good enough to debunk Hitchens, or anyone for that matter. So as for question 1, does the claim that 500 people witnessed the risen Jesus count as eyewitness testimony? The obvious answer is no. But what about the second question? Testimony though it isn't, does this claim count as evidence at the very least? This, of course, depends on your definition of evidence. One could argue that this claim counts as evidence, albeit in a very limited sense. It counts as evidence in the same way as asserting that 500 people were abducted by a UFO counts as evidence for a belief in aliens. I mean, ask yourself, would you be more likely to believe in aliens if an author of a UFO book simply asserted that 500 people witnessed an abduction? The author doesn't present the 500 individuals' names, they don't supply the individual eyewitness statements or anything else, just the claim that 500 people witnessed the abduction. Given this, would your confidence in the claim go up? I know mine wouldn't. And that's because assertions simply don't cut it. My evidential bar is higher than that. Perhaps on your definition of evidence, assertions could count as such, but even then, and to quote Michael, it's weak sauce.
Weak sauce.
As New Testament scholar Dr. Bart Ehrman put it,
Paul knows there's a story that 500 people saw him. But I don't think that's evidence that 500 people saw him. That's a claim, and so a claim isn't evidence. Evidence is when you try to substantiate the claim. And so how do you go about establishing whether 500 people actually saw Jesus? Well, you look at what Paul says, and then you see, are there other sources to corroborate it? Paul's writing before the Gospels. None of the Gospels mentions anything about this, or the Gospel sources. So Paul's our only source. And so is he right or not? Well, it seems like if 500 people saw him, that this would be something that other people would mention. So I don't think we know. We don't have groups of people saying they saw Jesus.
We have individual writers
We have
saying
writers saying that groups of people saw him. And that isn't the same thing.
So again, the question is, do assertions about the number of eyewitnesses instill you with a sense of confidence when it comes to believing in aliens? It certainly doesn't move my needle, and the same is true for the alleged appearance of Jesus to the 500. We simply have the claim that Jesus appeared to the 500. No individual accounts, no letters, no interviews, just a claim. Yet, a naive viewer wouldn't have realized this given Michael's portrayal, would they? I wonder why.
We're talking about 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection.
So after mentioning the 500, Michael goes on to address the apostles, inferring that it's also remarkably unlikely that they were deceived.
We're talking about all of the apostles being deceived. The earliest Gospels were written within 3 or 4 decades of the resurrection.
But before we even get to any possible apostolic misapprehensions, it's important to point out that the Bible isn't clear on whether or not the apostles were even present for certain events. During the crucifixion, for example, Matthew says, and I quote, "But all this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets. Then all the disciples left him and fled." Suffice to say, if the apostles had fled, how could they serve as eyewitnesses to anything? Michael may be quick to retort by quoting the Gospel of John, where it says, and I quote, "Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, 'Woman, here is your son,' and to the disciple, 'Here is your mother.'" So according to John, there was at least one apostolic eyewitness to the crucifixion. The problem is, of all the Gospels, John is the only one which says this. This inconsistency casts doubt on the reliability of the narrative. But even if we ignore the other Gospels and focus exclusively on John, there's problems. Of all the Gospels, the Gospel of John is the furthest divorced from the events to which it refers. Scholarship dates John to between 90 and 100 AD, and considering that Jesus' death is estimated to have occurred between 30 and 33 AD, this puts approximately 60 years between John's account and the events it recounts. So while Michael's claim about a 30-year gap between the events and the Gospels that record them may be true for the Gospel of Mark,
the earliest Gospels were written within 3 or 4 decades of the resurrection.
That's certainly not the case for the Gospel of John, the only Gospel, as it so happens, which suggests that an apostolic eyewitness was present at the crucifixion. All of this is to say, we have reasons to doubt this account. Furthermore, and to address the elephant in the room, it's quite likely that the Gospels contain no such examples of first-person eyewitness testimony. But don't take my word for it. Here's biblical scholar Dan McClellan on the matter.
The data indicate that there are no eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life in the New Testament, that the 4 Gospels were written and originally circulated anonymously, and that traditional authorship was only secondarily assigned toward the end of the 2nd century CE. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. And what I'm sharing is not my own argument, it is the state of the field. And the state of the field acknowledges that a close reading of the Gospels does not turn up a single first-person claim to being an eyewitness to Jesus' life.
Suffice to say, citing the 500 and or the apostles as eyewitnesses is problematic to say the least. That said, and despite the absence of eyewitness testimony, it's unlikely that the New Testament is based entirely on deceptions and lies. For this reason, many scholars are happy to accept, despite the absence of eyewitness testimony, that at least some of the apostles must have witnessed something that they sincerely interpreted as the resurrected Christ. As Dr. Bart Ehrman himself put it.
What do you think happened? Is someone lying? Is someone mistaken?
No, I don't think anybody's lying. Through this whole thing, I just think, I think a lot of atheists have this kind of binary, right? If it didn't happen, then somebody's lying about it. And that's just crazy. I mean, all of us have stories told about us that are not necessarily, sometimes we have people lying about us, but sometimes people just don't know any better. How do rumors start anyway? I mean, how do rumors start that 1,000 people saw this thing? 20 people saw this UFO. Well, where does that come from? It's not that somebody's lying about it, and it's usually not that 20 people saw it. So it just happens. That kind of thing happens when you tell stories.
With this in mind, I'm happy to grant, for the sake of discussion, that at least some of the apostles witnessed something, and that these things were written down later on by other people. However, before we even begin to discuss this point, I think it's important to acknowledge that we're already so far divorced from Michael's original assertion.
We're talking about 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection being deceived. We're talking about all of the apostles being deceived.
When, in actuality, we're talking about the assertion that 500 people witnessed the risen Jesus, and at best, we're talking about disparate accounts of the apostles having witnessed something and being written down later on in the form of hearsay. But I digress. Now that we understand that the strength of Michael's original claim is greatly diminished, does Hume's point become more compelling? Remember, Hume suggested that if one witnesses a miracle and or a suspension of the natural order, misapprehension is a likelier explanation than any appeal to miracles. Importantly, Michael can't rule out the misapprehension hypothesis with appeals to the 500 because, and as I've already demonstrated, we have no good evidence for that. So the question becomes, is it possible that a few of the apostles were mistaken and or subject to a misapprehension? Clearly, and at face value, this is plausible. Consider, for example, how close the apostles were to Christ, and how devastated they must have been after his death. And then consider the prevalence of grief hallucinations. Many watching this video will undoubtedly recount their own grief hallucinations, where they recognized a dead loved one in a crowd or somewhere else. These experiences are very real and traumatic. Couldn't this phenomenon account for some of these alleged post-resurrection appearances? In which case, Hume's point holds. Furthermore, isn't it possible that some of the apostles simply saw someone who looked like Jesus, and in their grief, they desperately accepted it as such? Isn't it possible that some of them may have been taking hallucinogens? According to my reading, we have some preliminary archaeological evidence which may point to hallucinogen usage in biblical times, and this would more than suffice to produce such visions. Sure, such evidence is sparse and perhaps even circumstantial, but given the propensity for hedonism amongst human beings, and given the presence of hallucinogenic ingredients in archaeological finds that date to biblical times, the hallucinogen hypothesis is a far likelier explanation than literal resurrection. By my lights, at least. The point is, and despite Michael's assumptions to the contrary, Hume's point holds. What's more likely, that the 12 apostles saw the resurrected Christ, or that they were suffering from grief, hallucinating, or something else? To quote Dr. Ehrman once again,
my opinion is that the most plausible explanation is this. We have, we know that Paul says that he saw him, and I don't think Paul's lying about it. I think Paul saw something, and he thought he saw Jesus 3 years afterwards. We have pretty good evidence to suggest that Peter was claiming that he saw Jesus. I mean, Paul says he was the first to see Jesus, and in the gospel accounts, he's there. Mary Magdalene, I would suppose Mary Magdalene probably had some kind of vision of Jesus. My sense is that these three people independently saw something they interpreted to be Jesus. They maybe had a vision of some sort. They mistook an identity. They had a dream. I don't know. Something happened to them, each of them. And they told others, who told others, who told others, and the story's propagated. This kind of thing happens all the time.
So Michael wants us to believe that these post-resurrection appearances actually happened. He wants us to accept these post-resurrection appearances at face value when all we have to go on is the Gospels, the earliest of which was written 30 years after the events to which they refer. Gospels which were written down after decades of an oral tradition. Gospels for which we have no original texts to corroborate. Instead, all we have is copies of translations of copies of translations. As Dr. Ehrman puts it,
we don't have a consistent independent narrative. What we have are independent narratives that contradict each other, that are all written 40, 50, 60 years later by people living in a different part of the world who didn't know any eyewitnesses, who aren't even speaking the same language. What you end up saying is that there was one man in the history of the human race who was raised from the dead, and we know that because some people said so, living decades later.
And Michael believes that this is compelling. Michael believes that a claim about eyewitness testimony is the same as eyewitness testimony. Well, if that's the case, Michael, didn't you know that your God has been debunked? Yeah, just the other day, 500 people witnessed the arrival to Earth of our extraterrestrial creators, aliens who seeded life on Earth. The 500 eyewitnesses said that the aliens even went so far as to explain exactly how life is created from non-life. No God required. It must be true, right? I mean, it couldn't be an hallucination or a misapprehension because 500 people witnessed it. Give me a break.
The earliest Gospels were written within 3 or 4 decades of the resurrection. That would be like me right now writing about Tupac Shakur. And I say, actually, Tupac rose from the dead. Well, if I said that, and if that story was spreading around, people would contradict me if it didn't really happen.
Michael appears to be arguing here that the alleged absence of dissenting voices serves as evidence for the truth of the resurrection narrative. First of all, that's ridiculous. The absence of dissenting voices does not serve as evidence for the truth of your mythology. If that were the case, then the wild ravings of a homeless man I once witnessed must have been true because everyone on the street was just ignoring him as they walked by. Nobody dissented, not one person. So he must have been spreading the truth, eh? Do you see how silly this talking point is? Worse still, Michael isn't even right about the absence of dissenting voices. Even the Bible says so. For example, in Acts, when Peter and John are preaching about the resurrection, the Sadducees arrest them because they didn't share their belief in the resurrection. Quote, "The priest and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came up to Peter and John while they were speaking to the people. They were greatly disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people, proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. They seized Peter and John and, because it was evening, they put them in jail until the next day." Another example of such dissension comes later in Acts, when Paul is on trial. During his plea to King Agrippa, the following transpires, and I quote, "I stand here and testify to small and great alike. I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that the Messiah would suffer and, as the first to rise from the dead, would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles." At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. "You are out of your mind, Paul," he shouted. "Your great learning is driving you insane." These are just 2 biblical examples of detractors, to say nothing of Roman persecution and Jewish rejection of Christian claims and so forth. So yeah, there were detractors, Michael, and to suggest otherwise demonstrates your ignorance not only about history, but about the very Bible you're defending in this video. So yes, if you said that Tupac was raised from the dead, people would undoubtedly contradict you, just like they did when the apostles made similar claims about Jesus.
When you see the New Testament accounts, it's referring to people who would have still been alive and whose relatives would have still been alive at the time those gospel accounts were circulating. And then you have 4 accounts, all of which basically agree with one another. And where they would seem to disagree on certain details, they do so in the way that newspapers disagree about news events. In fact, the fact that they seem to disagree about certain details or seem to approach events from different vantage points actually would be a mark in their favor. Because if they were all exactly, completely in lockstep on vantage point and every single line, you would say, oh, this was just contrived.
So here we have the classic Christian tactic of dismissing the contradictions that are found in the Gospels. Michael does this by suggesting that gospel contradictions are the equivalent of trivial differences that may manifest in newspapers all reporting on the same news story. But are the gospel contradictions really that trivial? Let's examine a couple. Did Jesus bear his own cross? Well, according to John 19:17, quote, "Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull." Yet, according to Matthew 27, verses 31 to 32, and I quote, "After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross." Furthermore, according to Mark 15, verses 21 through to 23, and I quote, "A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross." Not exactly a trivial newspaper-like difference in accounts, is it? In John, Jesus carries the cross, while in Matthew and Mark, Simon carries it. Is this contradiction, to quote Michael, really a mark in the narrative's favour?
In fact, the fact that they seem to disagree about certain details or seem to approach events from different vantage points actually would be a mark in their favor.
Before I respond, let's take a look at one more contradiction. What were the last words of Jesus before he died? According to Luke 23:46, Jesus says, quote, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." Whereas, according to John 19:30, Jesus' final words were, and I quote, "It is finished." And not to be satisfied with a simple bifurcated contradiction, Matthew 27:46 and Mark 15:34 both claim that Jesus' final words were, quote, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Needless to say, these accounts radically diverge. These aren't mere trivial differences, as Michael suggests. It's not like one account says that Jesus had brown hair and another account says that he had blonde hair. It's not like people are disagreeing over the colour of Jesus' tunic or something so trivial. No, we're talking about the central narrative of the crucifixion, the passion narrative, one of the most important features of the gospel narrative. And the gospel writers can't even agree on whether or not Jesus carried the cross, an absolutely central feature of the story. There is a significant difference between claiming that Jesus carried the cross on one hand and Simon carried the cross on the other. And to suggest that this is a trivial difference is to just disabuse the word trivial of its meaning. So again, the question is, and to quote Michael, do these contradictions serve as a mark in the narrative's favour? I don't think so. How could different witnesses arrive at such disparate accounts? And let's face it, via non-contradiction, these opposing accounts cannot all be correct. Jesus either carried the cross or he didn't. Jesus' last words were either X, Y, or Z. So somebody is mistaken. And if these accounts could be mistaken about something as significant as whether or not Jesus carried the cross, couldn't they be mistaken about other details? But no, according to Michael, these contradictions are a mark in favour of the truth of the narrative. In other words, what he's inferring here is that these contradictions serve as evidence for the authenticity of the narrative. After all, and as Michael put it, if these accounts were identical, collusion would be obvious.
Because if they were all exactly, completely in lockstep on vantage point and every single line, you would say, oh, this was just contrived.
But is this not just a case of having it all your own way? So where the Gospels differ, those differences serve as compelling evidence for their authenticity. But where they align, this also serves as evidence for their authenticity. The problem for Michael is that in order to take his point seriously, in order to accept that contradiction serves as evidence for authenticity, one would have to reject any and all gospel accounts which align. Because, a la Michael's point, alignment is evidence of contrivance, right?
You would say, oh, this was just contrived.
So we can safely dismiss the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they bear striking similarities throughout. But of course, no Christian will accept this. My point exactly. This is sophistry. The differences serve as compelling evidence, and the similarities serve as compelling evidence. It's utter nonsense.
You can't just take the Gospels at face value for this, because when you compare their narratives of the resurrection, they're more contradictory than the stories of the birth narratives. We don't have a consistent, independent narrative. What we have are independent narratives that contradict each other. That are all written 40, 50, 60 years later by people living in a different part of the world who didn't know any eyewitnesses, who aren't even speaking the same language.
Clearly, and this is obvious to anyone with a functioning brain, the significant differences and contradictions outlined in this video do not serve as evidence in favor of the truth of the narrative. I'm not saying that these contradictions debunk the narrative or serve as a knockdown argument against it either. All I'm trying to do here is point out that Michael's evidence for the truth of the resurrection is circumspect at best.
Weak sauce.
And as a consequence, nobody should take it seriously.
The fact that this was all circulated, the fact that we see this in non-Christian sources, the fact that this event changed the entire world and has withstood debunking for 2,000 years. And the best that Christopher Hitchens can offer is some stupid line from David Hume. Weak sauce.
And in closing, and in typical Christian fashion, Michael appeals to the spread, the proliferation of Christianity and its success on the global stage as evidence for its veracity.
The fact that this event changed the entire world.
But this is ludicrous. If successful proliferation is evidence of truth, then Michael would have to accept the truth of Islam, Hinduism, and a whole host of other ideas. Has Islam not successfully proliferated? Has Islam not changed the world?
they'll say, well, but so many people have come to believe this, that it's implausible that would happen if so many people believe. Well, there are about 2 billion people in the world who think that Muhammad was physically taken up into heaven. So do you use the same criteria, or do you make exceptions in your case?
And if Michael's claim is one of supremacy, where Christianity's truth is enshrined in the fact that it's the world's largest faith, are you telling me, Michael, that if and when Islam overtakes Christianity, that you're going to convert to Islam? I doubt it. And better still, does that mean that Christianity was false when Jesus was still alive, given the fact that in biblical times the faith had yet to ascend to the top spot? Again, I doubt it. Suffice to say, appeals to success and proliferation are irrational in the extreme, and Michael has made a fool out of himself for bringing it up. And with all that said, I want to make one final point. Did you notice how Michael completely ignored Christopher's second contention? Christopher was willing to grant all the miracles, including the resurrection, because it's a non sequitur to suggest that someone is God simply because they resurrected. As Christopher put it,
After all, Lazarus was raised, never said a word about it. The daughter of Jairus was raised, didn't say a thing about what she'd been through. And the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived. I'll give you all the miracles and you'll still be left exactly where you are now, holding an empty sack.
So resurrection does not a God make, even by biblical standards. So even if we, atheists, granted the resurrection, such a concession wouldn't serve as a guarantor of the divinity of Jesus, no more than the mass resurrection that allegedly occurred in Jerusalem serves as a guarantor of the divinity of those individuals. But what does Michael have to say on this matter? Nothing. Bupkis. Zero. And this silence coming from a man who's claiming to debunk Christopher Hitchens. I don't know about you, but I'd consider that pretty f***ing spectacular weak sauce.
Weak sauce.